I chose comfort over true love, an American life story. Narrated by a man who lost everything that mattered. Part 1. The Window. I am 63 years old, and every morning I sit in the chair next to the window that faces east. The window is nothing special. It has a single pane of glass, a wooden frame, and peeling paint around the edges. There is a crack in the lower left corner that has been there since the winter of 2019, and I keep meaning to fix it but never get around to it. I don't fix anything anymore. My coffee gets cold before I finish it. My toast stays on the plate until lunchtime, sometimes even longer. I sit and watch the sun rise over the rooftops of Hadley, Connecticut, and wait. I don't know what I'm waiting for. Maybe I'm waiting for the day to take on some meaning. Maybe I'm waiting for someone to walk through the door and say something important. Maybe I'm just waiting because that's what old people do when they no longer have a reason to get up. The house is quiet. It's been quiet for 6 years now, ever since Diane packed her things into a rental van and drove to her sister's place in Rhode Island. She took the television, the wind chimes from the porch, the scented candles, the little ceramic bowl she kept her rings in. She took everything that made noise. What she left behind was me and the silence, and a refrigerator that hums at 3 in the morning like it's trying to start a conversation nobody wants to have. I should tell you something right at the beginning before I lose my nerve. I chose comfort over love. Not once, not in some big dramatic moment with rain falling and music playing. I chose it slowly, quietly, across decades, in 1,000 tiny decisions I made with my eyes open and my heart half shut. I told myself I was being smart. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself that passion fades and stability lasts, and that the safe choice was the right choice. And maybe it was. Maybe for some people it is. But I'm sitting here now, 63 years old, alone in a house that smells like dust and instant coffee, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, it wasn't the right choice for me. If I could go back in time, and I know that's what every old man says, every person looking back on life with regret says those exact words. I could go back like some broken record nobody wants to hear. But if I could, I wouldn't go back to anything grand. I wouldn't rewrite history or undo some catastrophe. I'd walk into a small kitchen in a 4th-floor walk-up on Bleecker Street in New York City, sometime in the fall of 1987, where a woman named Catherine Morrow was cooking pasta with too much garlic and not enough sauce. And the window was cracked open because the radiator was going full blast, even though it was only October, and the whole apartment smelled like basil and cigarette smoke from the neighbor downstairs, and she was barefoot on the tile floor, humming something I didn't recognize, and I'd say to myself, to the version of me standing in that doorway with his jacket over his arm and his whole life ahead of him, I'd say, stay, you hear me? Stay in this kitchen. Stay with this woman. Don't leave. Don't you dare leave. But I left. I left because the kitchen was small, and the apartment was small, and the life she offered me was small in all the ways I was afraid of. I left because I was 26 years old, and I thought small meant failure and comfort, meant success and love was something you fit in after you'd figured out everything else. I was wrong. God, I was so wrong. My name is Thomas Edward Callahan. People used to call me Tom. My mother called me Tommy until the day she died, even when I was 45 and had gray in my hair and a mortgage and 2 kids who barely looked up from their phones when I walked in the door. Tommy, she'd say, like I was still 7 years old, sitting on the back porch in Darien with a popsicle dripping down my wrist. Tommy. I miss that. I miss being someone's Tommy. Nobody calls me anything much these days. The woman at the pharmacy calls me Mr. Callahan. My son David calls me Dad when he remembers to call, which is about once every 6 weeks. My daughter Rachel texts me sometimes. Short messages. Hope you're doing well. Little heart emoji. I stare at it for a while, then I put the phone down and look out the window again. This is what old age looks like. Not the version they show in the commercials, the silver-haired couple walking on the beach with a golden retriever. That's a fantasy and real old age. The kind I'm living is a man sitting alone in a house that's too big for him, drinking coffee that's gone cold, wondering where it all went. The mornings are the hardest. Not because of the loneliness. You get used to that, believe it or not. Loneliness becomes a kind of roommate after a while. No, the mornings are hard because of the remembering. When everything is still, when the house hasn't yet filled with the small noises of a day, your mind goes back. It doesn't ask permission. It just goes, like a dog off its leash, straight to the places you've been trying to avoid. And it always goes to her. Not to Diane. Not to the wife I spent 28 years with, the mother of my children. It goes to Catherine. To a woman I loved for 3 years in my 20s, in a city that doesn't exist anymore, not the way it was then. I live in this house alone. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a yard I pay a kid $20 to mow. The kitchen has granite countertops Diane picked out in 2006. I don't cook. I eat cereal in the morning, a sandwich at lunch, and something frozen at dinner. There's a dining room table that seats 8, and hasn't seated more than 1 since Diane left. I eat at the small desk in the kitchen because the dining room feels like a museum. The chairs pushed in, the candlesticks nobody ever lit. Waiting for a dinner party that's never coming. Upstairs, David's old room still has his wrestling trophies. Rachel's room still has a poster of some band I never learned the name of. I don't go up there much. The stairs bother my knees, and the rooms bother something deeper. They're frozen in a time when this house was full and loud and alive. Now they're just rooms. There's a photograph on my nightstand. It's not of Diane. It's not of the kids. It's a picture of Catherine, one I've carried for 36 years in wallets and dresser drawers and shoe boxes hidden in closets. She's sitting on a fire escape in the East Village, legs dangling, cigarette in her left hand, looking at something off to the side, not at the camera, and she's smiling. Not a big smile, just the corner of her mouth turned up, like someone told a joke she was still deciding whether to laugh at. Her hair is dark and messy from the wind, and she's wearing a denim jacket that was too big for her. Mine, I think. And behind her, the city is turning gold in the late afternoon light. I took that picture on a Saturday in September 1986. I was 25. She was 24. I remember she said, "Don't take my picture, Tom. I look terrible." And I said, "You've never looked terrible a single day in your life." And she rolled her eyes and looked away, and that's when I pressed the button. That accidental look, that half smile, that moment she didn't know she was being seen. I've looked at that picture 10,000 times. And every time the same thought comes, that was the last time I was truly happy. Not content, not comfortable, happy. The kind that sits in your chest like a warm hand and doesn't ask for anything in return. I keep the picture face down now most days, because looking at it hurts in a way I can't describe. Not a sharp pain, not the kind that makes you gasp. It's more like a deep ache, the kind you feel in your bones when the weather changes. The kind that's always there, humming beneath everything, even when you're distracted, even when you're watching a baseball game or reading the paper or pretending to care about whatever's on the news. It's there. She's there. The ghost of a life I didn't choose, living inside the life I did. The neighbors probably think I'm fine. Quiet guy, keeps to himself. They don't know about the photograph or the kitchen on Bleecker Street or the sound of a woman's laughter I hear sometimes late at night. They don't know that I am a man who had love. Real, true, once-in-a-lifetime love. And let it go because I was afraid. It cost me everything anyway. Just differently, just slower. So that's where I am, an old man in a quiet house with a cold cup of coffee and a photograph he can't stop looking at, and a story he's never told anyone. I've kept this story locked up for 36 years. That's a long time to carry something. The weight of an untold truth has a physical quality to it. It sits on your shoulders, it bends you, it makes you tired in ways that sleep can't fix. So I'm going to tell it, not because I think it'll help me. I'm past the age of believing in cures, but because someone out there might be standing in a doorway right now, the way I stood in a doorway in 1989, deciding whether to stay or go. Let me start with New York. Part 2. The choice. I moved to New York City in the summer of 1984, right after graduating from the University of Connecticut with a degree in business administration. I was 23 years old. I had $1,100 in savings, a suitcase of clothes my mother had ironed the night before, and the unshakable conviction that I was going to become somebody. My father was a high school math teacher in Darien. Good man, quiet. He came home at 4:15 every day, hung his coat on the same hook, sat in the same chair, watched the same news. He did that for 41 years. He was content, genuinely content, and that terrified me. not as contentment. I understand now there's courage in choosing a small life and loving it. But back then, at 23, all I could think was, not me. I will not sit in the same chair for 40 years. So I went to New York, found a job at a mid-sized insurance company in Midtown, and rented a studio on the Lower East Side that smelled like whatever the restaurant below it was cooking. The pay was terrible. The apartment was worse. I didn't care. I loved it, because it was mine. I met Catherine Morrow on a Thursday night in October 1985 at a bar on McDougal Street called The Lantern. It was a narrow, dim little place with a long wooden bar and a jukebox that only played jazz and folk music. The kind of bar where people actually talked to each other. She was sitting at the end of the bar, reading. That's the first thing I noticed. Not her face, not anything a 24-year-old man usually notices first in a bar. She was reading a paperback, so absorbed, she didn't look up when the bartender set her drink down, didn't look up when a group of loud guys came in. She just sat there, turning pages, her left hand wrapped around a glass of red wine. I thought, who reads in a bar? The kind of person I wanted to know, apparently. I sat down 2 stools away, ordered a beer, spent 10 minutes pretending not to stare. She looked up from her book and said, "You're terrible at pretending not to stare." I almost choked on my beer. "What are you reading?" I asked. She held up the book. The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. I'd never heard of it. She said, "It's about choices. About how the choices we think don't matter are actually the ones that define us." She just described the entire rest of my life. Her name was Catherine. She'd grown up in Burlington, Vermont, the daughter of a bookshop owner and a piano teacher. She'd come to New York to be a writer, which she said with a kind of defiant embarrassment. She worked part-time at a used bookstore and part-time waitressing, and she had a stack of notebooks filled with stories she'd never shown anyone. She was not beautiful in the way that word usually means. She was beautiful in a quieter way, the kind you had to look at twice to see, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Dark brown hair, always a little messy, brown eyes, warmer than any I'd ever looked into, a gap between her front teeth that she was self-conscious about and that I thought was the most charming thing I'd ever seen. We talked for 3 hours that night, until the bar closed, and then we walked. We walked from McDougal to Washington Square Park and sat on a bench, and she told me about her father's bookshop, and I told her about my father's chair, and she said, "There's nothing wrong with a chair, you know. Some people find their place, and that's a kind of bravery too." And I said, "Maybe, but I want to find my place first before I sit down." And she looked at me and said, "What if your place is a person and not a position?" I didn't have an answer for that. Not then. We started seeing each other. I don't want to call it dating because that word feels too small. What we did was more like falling. The way you fall in a dream, slow and weightless. Terrifying, but also the most free you've ever felt. She lived in that apartment on Bleecker Street. 4 flights of stairs, a kitchen the size of a closet, a bathroom with a shower that took 4 minutes to get warm. The place was filled with books. On shelves, on the floor, on top of the refrigerator. She had a typewriter on a small desk by the window, an old Royal from a flea market, and she wrote on it every morning before work. That clacking became the sound of home to me. We were poor, spectacularly poor. Pasta 4 nights a week, $6 wine, free concerts in the park, gallery openings where we ate little cheese cubes and pretended to understand the art. On weekends we'd walk across the Brooklyn Bridge just because it was there, just because walking next to her made everything feel like an adventure. Those 3 years were not perfect. We fought about money, the future, my ambition, and her stubbornness. She called me a coward once. I called her a dreamer. We were both right. But beneath the fighting, there was a thing, a current. When I was with her, even when we were arguing, there was a part of me, deep and quiet, that felt right. Like I was standing in exactly the right place on the earth. Like my molecules had been rearranged to fit the shape of her. That feeling was real. It was the realest thing I've ever known. And I walked away from it. In the spring of 1988, I got a real promotion at work. Commercial Accounts Division. More money, more responsibility, more of the feeling that I was becoming somebody. My boss, Gerald Preston, took me aside and said, "Tom, you've got potential, but you need to decide what you want. This business rewards people who are all in." All in. Those words stuck to me. I went home that night and looked around Catherine's apartment. The books, the typewriter, the chipped plates, the life that was beautiful and chaotic and terrifyingly unplanned. Then I thought about Gerald Preston's office, the leather chair, the mahogany desk, the photographs of his family, the view from the 20th floor. The order of it. The certainty. Something shifted. I started staying later at work, volunteering for weekend projects, using words like trajectory and 5-year plan. Catherine noticed. "You're different," she said one night. "You're here, but you're not here. I'm just busy. It's temporary." "Temporary," she repeated, flat, like a door closing. Around that same time, I met Diane Halstead at a company barbecue, a kindergarten teacher from Stamford with blonde hair and a laugh that carried across the yard. She was pleasant, easygoing, told me about her classroom, and I laughed, not because it was particularly funny, but because laughing with Diane was easy. That's the word, easy. No friction, no arguments about money or art, no terrifying feeling that the ground was shifting. She was solid. She was the human equivalent of a house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage. I didn't fall in love with Diane. I want to be clear about that. I stepped, carefully, deliberately, the way you step into a warm bath. Not because it thrills you, but because it soothes you. I started seeing Diane while I was still with Catherine. I know what that makes me. I didn't sleep with Diane, but I had lunches with her, called her from my office phone, and slowly built a second version of myself, cleaner, simpler, that fit into her world like a key in a lock. The two lives ran parallel through the fall of 1988, Catherine in the evenings. The clacking typewriter, conversations until 3 in the morning about books and dreams. Diane on weekday lunches, bright restaurants, conversations about real estate and retirement accounts. 2 worlds, 2 possible futures, standing side by side like doors in a hallway. Catherine found out in December. She found Diane's name in my address book. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not in front of me. She just sat on the edge of the bed, very still, and said, "You've already decided, haven't you?" It wasn't a question. She was right. I had decided, not consciously, but in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small choices. "She's not me," Catherine said. "She can't give you what I give you." "Maybe that's the point," I said. It was the cruelest thing I've ever said. What I should have said was, "What you give me is too big, too much, too real. It fills up every room and leaves no space for the neat, orderly life I think I'm supposed to build. I love you so much it terrifies me, and I'm going to run from it towards something safe." But I said, "Maybe that's the point." And she stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a long time. "Go," she said, quietly, like exhaling. I packed my things, a toothbrush, a couple of shirts. I walked to the door and turned around. She was still at the window, her back to me, arms crossed. I wanted to say everything. The words were too big, and I was too afraid, so I said nothing. I closed the door. I walked down 4 flights of stairs and stepped onto Bleecker Street on a cold December night, and the city was loud and bright and completely indifferent to the fact that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. I walked for hours, past the bar on McDougal, past the bench in Washington Square. Every block was a memory. Every corner was a piece of a life I was giving up. I told myself passion fades and practicality endures. I told myself Catherine would be fine. I told myself all the things we tell ourselves when we're running away from love and trying to call it running towards something. In the spring of 1989, I married Diane Halstead in a small church in Stamford. My mother cried. My father shook my hand and said, "She's a good woman, Tommy." And she was, and I spent 28 years lying next to her, staring at the ceiling, thinking about someone else. Part 3. The cost. Here's the thing about choosing comfort. It works. For a while. Sometimes for a long while. It delivers exactly what it promises. No surprises, no turbulence, no moments where the ground drops out from under you and you're free falling with nothing to grab. Comfort is a warm house on a cold day. Comfort is knowing what's for dinner, Comfort is a life that fits neatly into a Christmas card. Husband, wife, 2 kids, a dog, a house with a blue door, in a town where nothing much happens and everything stays roughly the same. Diane and I built that life. I want to give it its due because it wasn't nothing. It wasn't a waste. There were good years in there, real ones, years when I came close to convincing myself that I'd made the right choice, that the ache in my chest was just some leftover thing, some phantom limb from a life I'd amputated, and that it would fade with time the way everything fades. We bought the house in Hadley in 1991, a colonial, 4 bedrooms, white siding, black shutters, the kind of house that looks like it was drawn by a child who was asked to draw a house. It had a big yard with an oak tree and a garage that fit 2 cars and a front porch where Diane put flower boxes in the spring and wreaths in the winter. The neighborhood was full of families like ours. Young, upwardly mobile, cautiously optimistic, driving Volvos and grilling burgers on weekends and talking about school districts like they were choosing colleges for their unborn children. David was born in 1992. Rachel in 1995. And for a while, maybe 5 years, maybe 7, the machinery of family life was so consuming, so relentless, that I didn't have time to think about what I'd left behind. Diapers and feedings and midnight crying and first steps and first words and the avalanche of needs that a small human generates every hour of every day. It fills your entire field of vision. It crowds everything else out. I remember a period, maybe 1993 to 1998, when I barely thought about Catherine at all. She was there, somewhere in the basement of my memory, but the door was closed, and the noise upstairs was too loud to hear anything from below. I was doing well at work, better than well. The insurance company had merged with a larger firm, and I'd survived the transition, which in corporate America is a little like surviving a war. You emerge blinking and grateful and slightly guilty about the people who didn't make it. By 1996, I was a senior account manager. By 2000, I was a vice president. The title came with a corner office, not as nice as Gerald Preston's, but a corner office nonetheless, with windows on 2 sides and a view of a parking lot that I somehow found inspiring. I wore suits that fit well. I drove a car that started every time I turned the key. I had a 401k that was growing, and a mortgage that was shrinking, and a life that, from the outside, looked like exactly what success was supposed to look like. Diane was happy. Or she seemed happy. Or I told myself she was happy because her happiness was the justification for everything. For the choice I'd made, for the life I'd built, for the love I'd abandoned. If Diane was happy, then I was right. If the marriage worked, then the math worked. If the kids were thriving and the bills were paid and the house was warm and the dinners were on time, then I'd won. I'd beaten the uncertainty. I'd chosen rock over sand and the house was standing. But here's what they don't tell you about building your house on rock. Rock is hard. Rock is cold. Rock doesn't bend. Rock doesn't forgive. And when you live on it long enough, you start to feel the hardness in your bones, in your jaw, in the way you hold your shoulders, in the tight, careful way you move through a life that has no give in it, no softness, no room for the messy, unpredictable, glorious things that make a person feel alive. I became a certain kind of man in those years, a reliable man, a dependable man, the man who showed up with a checkbook and a firm handshake and a plan for every contingency. I mowed the lawn on Saturdays. I grilled on Sundays. I went to David's wrestling matches and Rachel's dance recitals, and I sat in the bleachers with the other fathers, and I clapped, and I smiled, and I looked like a man who had everything figured out, but inside, and I know how this sounds, I know it sounds like self-pity, and maybe it is. Maybe I've earned a little self-pity at this point. Inside, I was hollowing out. Slowly, imperceptibly, the way a river erodes a bank. You don't see it happening, you don't hear it, you just look up one day, and the ground you thought was solid has been washed away, and there's nothing underneath but empty space. It started with small things. A song on the radio that reminded me of the jukebox at the Lantern, a woman on the street with dark, messy hair who looked, for one heart-stopping second, like Catherine. A night in September when the air turned crisp and I stood on the front porch and smelled something. What was it, basil? Cigarette smoke? And I was transported instantaneously to a fire escape in the East Village, 30 years and 1,000 miles away. And the ache hit me so hard I had to grip the porch railing to keep from buckling. These moments came more frequently as the years went on. They were like tremors before an earthquake, small, barely noticeable at first, but building in frequency and intensity until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I'd be sitting in a meeting, listening to someone talk about quarterly projections, and suddenly I'd hear Catherine's voice. What if your place is a person and not a position? I'd be lying in bed next to Diane, listening to her breathing, and I'd think about another woman's breathing, about the way Catherine used to fall asleep, with her hand on my chest, like she was checking to make sure my heart was still going. I want to tell you about a night that changed something in me. It was October 2003. David was 11, Rachel was 8. Diane had gone to bed early. She always went to bed early. She was a teacher. She got up at 5:30. And I was downstairs in the living room with a glass of scotch, which I'd started drinking more of. Not enough to be a problem. Not yet, but more than was probably healthy. The television was on, but I wasn't watching it. I was thinking. I got up and went to the hall closet, the one with the coats and the boots and the boxes of things we never used but couldn't throw away. On the top shelf, behind a box of Christmas ornaments, there was a shoebox. I'd kept it there for years, moving it whenever Diane reorganized the closet, always finding a new hiding spot that was deep enough and dark enough to be safe. Inside the shoebox was the photograph of Catherine on the fire escape, and 3 other things. A matchbook from the lantern, a small piece of paper with her handwriting on it, a list of books she wanted me to read, written in blue ink, her handwriting loopy and confident, and a dried flower, some kind of wildflower that she'd picked from a median on 6th Avenue one afternoon and tucked behind my ear and said, "There. Now you're beautiful." I sat on the closet floor with the shoebox in my lap, and I looked at these things, and I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. I cried the way old pipes leak. Slowly, steadily, without any hope of being fixed. I cried for the woman I'd left. I cried for the man I'd been when I was with her. Braver, kinder, more alive. I cried for the life we might have had, the apartment that might have gotten bigger, the stories she might have published, the mornings I might have woken up to the sound of typewriter keys and known that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And when I was done, I put everything back in the shoebox and put the shoebox back behind the Christmas ornaments and closed the closet door and went to bed next to Diane and stared at the ceiling until the alarm went off at 5:30. That became a ritual. Not every night, not even every week, but often enough. I'd wait until the house was asleep, and I'd go to the closet and I'd sit with those objects, and I'd let myself feel the thing I spent the rest of my hours suppressing. It was like a pressure valve. It kept me functional. It kept the surface of my life intact while the interior slowly came apart. The marriage suffered. Of course it did. You can't live with someone for decades while secretly grieving another person and expect it not to show. Diane felt it, even if she couldn't name it. She felt it in the way I flinched when she touched me sometimes. Not because I didn't want to be touched, but because the wrong person was touching me, and the guilt of that thought was unbearable. She felt it in the distance that crept into our conversations, the way we went from talking about everything to talking about schedules and logistics and who was picking up the kids on Thursday. She felt it in the bedroom, where our intimacy became a kind of maintenance. Regular, functional, devoid of the desperation and hunger that real desire carries. She tried. I want to say that clearly because Diane tried. She suggested couples retreats. She left articles about communication on my pillow. She asked me once on a drive home from her mother's house with the kids asleep in the back seat, "Are you happy, Tom?" And I don't mean, "Are you fine?" I don't mean, "Are you comfortable?" I mean, "Are you happy?" I said yes. I lied. I looked at the road and I lied to a woman who had given me 20 years of her life and 2 children and a home and her absolute unwavering loyalty. And I said, "Yes, I'm happy. Of course I'm happy. Why wouldn't I be happy?" She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "Okay." And she turned and looked out the window, and the conversation was over, and we never had it again. Not because the question went away, but because she'd heard the lie, and she decided, I think, well, that the lie was preferable to whatever the truth might be. The years accumulated. That's the only word for it. They didn't pass. They accumulated like snow on a roof, each one adding a little more weight, a little more pressure, until the structure underneath started to groan. David grew up and became serious and quiet, and went to the University of Michigan, and then to law school, and then to a firm in Boston where he worked 80 hours a week, and called me every few weeks, and sounded tired in a way I recognized, because it was the same tired I'd been my whole life. The tiredness of a man running towards something he can't name. Rachel grew up and became warm and funny, and went to nursing school, and married a man named Kevin, who sold pharmaceutical equipment, and they moved to North Carolina, and I saw them twice a year, at Christmas and sometime in the summer, and each visit was pleasant and brief, and left me feeling more alone afterward than I'd felt before. Diane and I became roommates. That's what happens to a lot of marriages, I think, especially the ones built on comfort instead of love. The scaffolding stays up. The shared meals, the shared bed, the shared checking account. But the thing inside, the living thing, the beating heart of the partnership, it withers. It dries up like a creek in August. And you walk past it every day, and you know it used to be full, but you can't remember the last time you heard water running. We didn't fight. That was the strange part. We never fought. Catherine and I had fought constantly. Loud, passionate, exhausting arguments that left us wrung out and then tangled in each other's arms, arguing and making up in the same breath. With Diane, there was nothing to fight about. Everything was fine. The bills were paid. The house was clean. The kids were growing. Everything was fine and fine and fine, and fine is the deadliest word in the English language because it disguises despair as contentment, and nobody questions it. I retired in 2017. 41 years at the same company, the last 12 as a senior vice president. They gave me a party in the conference room on the 6th floor. Cake, balloons, a plaque that said, "In appreciation of your years of dedicated service." My colleagues shook my hand and said nice things, and a few of them looked genuinely sad, and most of them looked like they were already thinking about what they were going to have for lunch. I drove home with the plaque on the passenger seat and I put it in the garage, leaning against the wall, and I never looked at it again. Retirement was supposed to be the reward, the golden years, the time when all that working and saving and sacrificing finally paid off and you got to enjoy the fruits of your labor. But the fruits of my labor were a quiet house, and a wife I'd grown apart from, and 2 adult children who had their own lives, and a 401k that could sustain me for decades, and absolutely nothing to sustain me emotionally. Without work, there was no buffer, no noise, no meetings and reports and deadlines to fill the hours and crowd out the thoughts, just me and Diane and the house and the silence and the slow, terrible realization that I'd traded my one wild, precious, love-drunk life for a pension and a plaque that was gathering dust in the garage. Diane left in 2019. She didn't leave dramatically. There was no screaming match, no shattered plates, no slamming doors. She came into the kitchen one morning while I was eating cereal, and she stood there with her hands folded in front of her the way she stood when she had something difficult to say to a student's parents. And she said, "Tom, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think it's better for both of us if I go stay with Carol for a while." Carol was her sister in Rhode Island. A while turned into permanently. She filed for divorce 6 months later. Irreconcilable differences, the most bloodless phrase in the legal vocabulary for a marriage that died of neglect. She said something during one of our last conversations that I've never forgotten. We were sitting at the dining room table, the one that seats 8, and now seats none, going over the paperwork, dividing up a life like it was an estate sale. She put down her pen and looked at me and said, "Tom, who is she?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Bree, the woman you've been thinking about for the last 28 years, the one you see when you close your eyes, the one who made you cry in the closet at 2 in the morning. She knew. She'd always known. Not the name, not the details, but the shape of it, the absence, the ghost that lived in our marriage alongside us, sleeping between us every night like an uninvited guest." "Catherine," I said. It was the first time I'd said her name out loud in years. It felt like breaking a seal. Diane nodded slowly, like she was confirming something she'd suspected for decades. Then she said, very quietly, "I wish you'd told me. Not because it would have changed anything, but because I spent 28 years thinking something was wrong with me. That sentence, that quiet, devastating sentence, it cracked something in me that hasn't healed, because she was right. There was nothing wrong with her. There was never anything wrong with her. She was kind and patient and loyal and good, and she deserved a husband who loved her the way she loved him, fully, openly, without reservation. Instead, she got me, a man who gave her his body and his name and his paycheck and withheld the only thing that mattered, his whole heart. She drove away on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I stood on the porch and watched the rental van disappear around the corner, and I thought, this is what you chose. This empty porch, this empty house, this empty life. You had love and you ran from it, and you had a good woman who tried to love you and you starved her, and now you have neither, and you deserve neither, and the silence you're about to walk into is the silence you built with your own two hands. I went inside, I closed the door, I sat down in the kitchen, and I stared at the granite countertops that Diane had loved, the ones I'd never cared about, and I felt the full weight of everything I'd done and not done crash down on me like a wave I'd been outrunning for 30 years. And the house was quiet. And it's been quiet ever since. Part 4. The realization. After Diane left, I did what a lot of newly alone people do. I tried to find Catherine, not right away. For the first few months I just sat. I sat in the house and I ate my cereal and my sandwiches and my frozen dinners, and I watched the days pass like trains I wasn't getting on. I called David once a week and got his voicemail more often than not. I texted Rachel and received her kind, brief replies. I went to the hardware store and the pharmacy and the grocery store, and I came home and I sat some more. The sitting was its own kind of activity. It took effort, in a strange way. Sitting with yourself, with the truth of yourself, when there's no one around to distract you or validate you or reassure you that you're fine. That takes a kind of strength I didn't know I had. But eventually the sitting wasn't enough, and the silence became too loud, and the photograph on my nightstand. I'd taken it out of the shoebox after Diane left. No need to hide it anymore. The absurd, tragic irony of that. The photograph started to feel like a question I had to answer. Where was she? What had happened to her? Was she alive? Was she happy? Did she ever think about me, about us, about the kitchen on Bleecker Street and the fire escape and the walks across the Brooklyn Bridge? I started on the internet. I'm not good with computers. Never was, never cared to be, but I know enough to type a name into a search bar and hit enter. I typed Catherine Morrow and I got thousands of results. None of them her. Catherine Morrows all over the country. Lawyers, teachers, dentists, Instagram accounts with pictures of vacations and babies and meals, but not my Catherine, not the woman with the dark, messy hair and the gap between her teeth and the typewriter on the desk by the window. I tried narrower searches. Catherine Morrow writer. Catherine Morrow, New York. Catherine Morrow, Vermont, Burlington. I found a few things. A short story published in a small literary journal in 1992. Her name in a list of participants at a writing workshop in upstate New York in 1995. A mention in a community newspaper in Portland, Maine from 2001, something about a reading at a local bookstore. Breadcrumbs. Tiny, scattered fragments of a life I hadn't been part of. The trail went cold after 2001. No more publications, no more readings, no more mentions. She'd either stopped writing or stopped publishing, or she'd changed her name, or she'd simply stepped out of the digital world the way some people do, choosing invisibility in an age that demands the opposite. I couldn't find an address, a phone number, an email, anything. She'd vanished, or she'd never appeared, depending on how you looked at it. The internet only knows you if you've let it know you, and Catherine, I thought, would have been the kind of person who never let it. I thought about hiring someone, a private investigator, someone who could track her down through records and databases and whatever dark arts those people use. I even looked up a few names, but I didn't call. I didn't call because I was afraid of what I might find. Not that she was dead, though that fear was there, cold and sharp like a stone in my shoe, but that she was alive, that she was happy, that she'd built the life she'd wanted, the life of writing and books and meaning, and that she'd built it without me, and that seeing proof of that would be the final, irrefutable evidence that my leaving had not been a noble sacrifice but a stupid, selfish, cowardly act that cost two people everything. Or worse, that she wasn't happy. That my leaving had broken something in her the way it had broken something in me, and that she'd spent the last 30 years carrying the same ache, the same ghost, the same photograph, metaphorical or otherwise, and that we'd both waste our lives mourning each other from opposite ends of a distance neither of us had the courage to close. I didn't hire the investigator. I put the phone down and I stared at the wall, and I decided, in the way you decide things when you're 60 and exhausted and afraid, that not knowing was better than knowing. That the Catherine in my memory, young, barefoot, half-smiling on a fire escape, was better than whatever reality would give me. That the dream, even a painful dream, was preferable to waking up. I know that was cowardice. I know. I've named it to myself 100 times. Coward. The same word Catherine called me in that fight in February 1988, and she was right then and she's right now, and I've been a coward my whole life, not in the obvious ways. I wasn't afraid of hard work or responsibility or the things that scare most people, but in the deep way, the fundamental way, the way that counts. I was afraid of being seen, truly, fully, completely seen by another person. And Catherine saw me. She saw through every suit and every title and every performance, and she saw the scared boy from Darien who was trying so hard to be somebody that he forgot to be anybody. Being seen like that is unbearable. It's the most intimate thing in the world, more intimate than anything physical, and it demands a kind of surrender that I was never capable of. Diane never saw me that way. She saw the version I presented. Responsible Tom. Reliable Tom. Tom who pays the bills and mows the lawn and says yes when he means no. She accepted that version because it was easy to live with, and I offered that version because it was easy to maintain, and together we built a life on a foundation of mutual pretending that lasted 28 years before it collapsed under its own weight. After the divorce, something happened that I need to tell you about because it's the thing that finally, fully, permanently broke me. It was the fall of 2020. The pandemic was raging. I was alone in the house, like everybody was alone in those days, and the isolation that had been merely uncomfortable before the pandemic became something darker, something heavier. I stopped getting dressed some days. I stopped eating regular meals. I stopped calling David and Rachel because the conversations, brief as they were, required a level of performance I no longer had the energy for. I sat in my chair by the window, and I watched the empty streets, and I thought about how strange it was that the whole world was now living the way I'd been living for years. Alone, afraid, waiting for something to end. In October of that year, I got a letter, not an email, not a text, a letter, handwritten, on cream-colored stationery, in blue ink. The handwriting was shaky, not the loopy, confident script I remembered, but I recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a melody even when it's played on a different instrument. It was from Catherine. My hands shook when I opened it. I mean physically shook, the way they shake when you're holding something sacred and you're terrified of dropping it. I sat down at the kitchen table, the one that seats 8 and seats none, and I read the letter, and I'm going to tell you what it said, as close to the exact words as I can remember, because I've read it so many times that it's burned into me the way that photograph is burned into me. She wrote, "Tom, I thought about not writing this. I've thought about not writing it every day for 30 years, and every day I decided against it. And today, I decided differently. I don't know why today. Maybe because the world is strange right now, and strange times make people brave, or at least foolish, which might be the same thing. I live in Maine now, a small town called Blue Hill, on the coast. I can see the ocean from my window. I have a cat named Tolstoy, because he's large and complicated, and Russian-looking, which doesn't make sense because he's a tabby, but the name stuck. I never married. I came close once, with a man named James who taught literature at a college here, but I ended it because I couldn't do to him what you did to me, and I knew I would, because I've never loved anyone the way I loved you, and holding that up against someone else's love is a cruelty I wasn't willing to commit. I published a book. One book, a collection of short stories in 2003, a small press in Portland. It didn't sell much, but it was mine and it was real, and a few people read it and told me it meant something to them, and that was enough. In ITH now. At a community center. Creative writing, mostly older women who are discovering that they have stories to tell. It's good work. It keeps me useful. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty or to ask you for anything. I'm writing because I'm 61 years old and I've spent too many years holding words inside, and I'm a writer for God's sake. And a writer who can't say what she needs to say is just a person with a very expensive typewriter. I loved you. I love you still, which I know is ridiculous and probably unhealthy. But there it is. You were the great love of my life and you left, and I survived. And I built something from the wreckage, and it's a good life, a quiet life, a life I'm proud of. But there are nights. You know what I mean, Tom. I know you do. There are nights when the wind comes off the ocean and the house is quiet and I close my eyes and I'm back in that kitchen and you're standing in the doorway. And I can feel the whole future hanging in the air between us like a held breath. I don't want you to come find me. I don't want to start over. It's too late for that, and we both know it. I just wanted you to know that you were loved. Completely. The way people hope to be loved and almost never are. You had it. I hope that means something. I hope it was worth knowing. Catherine. I sat with that letter for a very long time. I don't know how long. The light changed. The day went from afternoon to evening. The kitchen got dark and I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat there holding the letter, feeling the weight of every word, like a stone being placed on my chest, one by one, until I couldn't breathe. She loved me. She still loved me. She'd spent 30 years loving me, the way I'd spent 30 years loving her. And we'd both carried this enormous, useless, beautiful, devastating thing across decades and distances and entire separate lives. And neither of us had ever said it out loud. And now here it was, in blue ink, on cream-colored paper, and it was too late. Too late. The two most terrible words in the English language. Not, I'm sorry. Not, goodbye. Too late. Because too late means the door was open, and now it's closed. It means the window was there, and now it's bricked over. It means the chance existed. It was real. It was possible, and you watched it pass because you were looking the other way. I wrote her back. I wrote 12 drafts. Each one was terrible in a different way. Too formal, too emotional, too apologetic, too casual, too honest. Not honest enough. I settled on something short. I told her I'd gotten her letter. I told her I thought about her every day. I told her about the shoebox in the closet, the photograph, the dried flower. I told her she was the great love of my life too, and that I'd known it the moment I walked out her door in December 1988, and that knowing it and admitting it were different things, and I was sorry, sorrier than any word could capture, for taking 32 years to admit it. I mailed the letter on a Monday. I checked the mailbox every day for 3 weeks, waiting for a response. The response came, but not from Catherine. It came from a woman named Sarah Langford, who identified herself as Catherine's neighbor in Blue Hill. The letter was brief and gentle, and it said that Catherine had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the summer of 2020, and that she had passed away on November 14th, 16 days after I mailed my letter. Sarah wrote that she'd found my letter among Catherine's things and had opened it, hoping it contained information about family members to contact. She apologized for reading it. She said Catherine had spoken of me near the end, though she didn't use my name. She'd said, "There was someone a long time ago. Tell him I wasn't angry. Tell him I understood." I don't remember what I did after reading that letter. I know I didn't leave the house for several days. I know the cereal went stale and the mail piled up, and at some point David called, and I didn't answer, and he called again and I didn't answer, and then Rachel called, and I answered because I was afraid if I didn't she'd drive up from North Carolina. And I said I was fine. I said I was just fighting a cold. I said I'd call her back in a few days. I didn't call her back in a few days. I called her back in 2 weeks. And by then I'd showered and eaten a meal and taken a walk and done all the things that pass for recovery when you're 62 years old and the last thread connecting you to the person you used to be has been cut. Catherine was gone. She'd lived in a small town on the coast of Maine with a cat named Tolstoy and a book of short stories that almost nobody read, and a community writing class, and a view of the ocean, and a heart that still held a place for me. And then she was gone, and I never saw her again, not once, in all those years. Not once since December 1988, when I walked out of her apartment with a bag of clothes and a chest full of something I didn't have the courage to name. There was no funeral I could attend. By the time I learned of her death, she'd already been cremated. Sarah told me that Catherine's ashes had been scattered in the harbor at Blue Hill, per her wishes. I drove up there in the spring of 2021, alone, and I stood on the dock and looked at the water, gray and cold, and endlessly moving, and I tried to say something. A prayer, an apology, a goodbye. But nothing came. My mouth opened and closed, and no sound came out. And I stood there for what must have been an hour, silent, looking at the ocean that held what was left of her. I drove home. I sat in my chair. I looked out the window. That was 2 years ago, and in those 2 years, I've had a lot of time to think. Time is the one thing I have in abundance now, the great irony of a life spent treating time like a commodity to be spent on productive things. I have more time than I know what to do with, and I spend most of it thinking about the things I can't undo. I think about Diane. I wonder if she's happy in Rhode Island. I hope she is. I hope she found someone or something that gives her what I never could. A full heart, an undivided attention, a love that doesn't have a ghost in it. She deserved that. She always deserved that. I think about David and Rachel. I wonder what I taught them about love. I wonder if they saw, in the quiet, careful, affectionless way Diane and I cohabited, a model for what marriage looks like. And I wonder if that model has shaped their own relationships, and the thought makes me sick. I wonder if David works 80 hours a week because he watched me work 60 and learned that work is what men do instead of feeling. I wonder if Rachel chose a kind, steady, slightly boring man because she watched her mother choose one and thought that's what safety looked like. I think about my father, the man in the chair, the 41 years of the same hook, the same news, the same routine. And I think about how I spent my whole youth running from that, from the smallness of his life, from the sameness of it, and how I ended up exactly where he was, alone, in a chair, staring out a window, counting the days. The only difference is that my father was at peace in that chair, and I am not. And I think about Catherine. I think about her every morning when I sit by the window with my cold coffee. I think about her when the light turns gold in the late afternoon, the way it did on that fire escape. I think about her when I see a woman carrying a book, or when I hear a typewriter in an old movie, or when I smell garlic, or when the wind picks up and I close my eyes and I'm back. I'm always back, in that kitchen, in that apartment, in that life that I chose not to live. I think about the question she asked me on a bench in Washington Square Park in the fall of 1985, when we were young and the city was big and the future was nothing but open doors. What if your place is a person and not a position? She was right. My place was a person. My place was her. And I left my place because I was afraid of how much it meant to me. And I went somewhere safe, somewhere clean, somewhere manageable. And I spent 40 years managing a life that was never mine. Who will remember me? The question comes at night, always at night, when the house is at its quietest and the dark is at its darkest. Who will remember Thomas Edward Callahan? My children will, for a while. My name will be on a headstone somewhere, for as long as headstones last. The company I gave 41 years to will have my name in a filing cabinet, if filing cabinets still exist. But the person who knew me, truly knew me, the person who saw me the way no one else ever did, she's gone. She's ashes in a harbor in Maine. And the version of me she knew, the brave, scared, alive version, the one who walked across bridges and sat on fire escapes and fell in love so hard it felt like flying. That version died a long time ago, on a cold December night on Bleecker Street, and I've been carrying his body ever since. Part 5D. The lesson. I said at the beginning that I wasn't sure why I was telling this story. That was a lie. I know why. I'm telling it because I'm 63 years old, and I'm sitting in a chair, and I don't have many stories left, and this is the only one that matters. I'm not going to give you a speech. I'm not going to tell you to follow your passion, or live your truth, or dance like nobody's watching, or whatever else they put on motivational posters in corporate break rooms. That stuff is noise. It sounds good, and it means nothing, and it doesn't help when you're standing in a doorway at 27 years old, trying to decide between a woman who makes you feel alive and a life that makes you feel safe. What I'm going to tell you is simpler and harder and less inspirational, and it's this. Comfort is not the same as happiness, and safety is not the same as peace. I know they feel the same. I know that when you're lying in a warm bed in a quiet house with the bills paid and the doors locked and the future planned out in neat little columns on a spreadsheet, it feels like happiness. It feels like you've won. But there's a difference, and the difference is this. Happiness has a pulse. It moves, it breathes, it keeps you up at night not from anxiety, but from excitement. It makes you feel like the world is wider than you thought. Comfort doesn't do that. Comfort puts you to sleep. Comfort tucks you in and turns out the lights, and whispers everything is fine, and you believe it because you want to, because the alternative, uncertainty, risk, the raw, exposed vulnerability of loving someone so much that their absence would destroy you. The alternative is too frightening to face. I chose comfort. I chose it with my eyes open. I chose it because I was afraid. And because the world I grew up in, small-town Connecticut in the 1960s and 70s, American life as it was sold to boys like me, that world taught me that love was something you fit into a structure, not something you built a life around. Get the job, get the house, get the wife. Love would follow, they said. Or it wouldn't. And that was okay too, because you had the structure, and the structure would hold. The structure held. It held for 28 years, and then it didn't. And when it collapsed, there was nothing underneath. No love, no passion, no meaning, just a man in a chair staring at a window, holding a photograph of the woman he should have stayed with. If you're young, and young is relative, anyone younger than me is young at this point. If you're young and you're reading this, I want to ask you something. Not tell you, ask you. Because I've learned that advice from old men is about as useful as an umbrella in a hurricane. You either figure it out or you don't. And mostly you don't, until it's too late. And that's the human condition, and there's no getting around it. But I'll ask anyway. Is there someone in your life right now? A person, not a position, not a salary, not a title. A person who makes you feel like the truest version of yourself. Someone who sees you. Really sees you, not the resume version, but the real version, the scared and hopeful and messy version, someone who makes you feel brave just by being in the room. And are you walking away from them? Are you walking away because they're inconvenient, because they don't fit the plan, because loving them would require giving up something, a city, a career, a lifestyle, a version of yourself that looks good on paper? Are you telling yourself it's the smart move, the practical move, the adult thing to do? I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. You might be right. Some loves don't work out, no matter how hard you try. Some people aren't meant to be together, no matter how much they feel. I'm not naive. I'm 63 years old, and I've seen enough to know that love alone doesn't pay the rent. But I'll tell you this. I have never, not once, in all my years of sitting in this chair, looked out this window and thought, I wish I'd been more practical. I've never thought, I'm so glad I chose the safe option. I've never thought, thank God I didn't stay in that apartment with that woman and that typewriter and that life that scared me. Not once, not one single time. What I think every day, every morning, every evening, in the space between waking and sleeping when the mind is most honest, is, I wish I'd stayed. I wish I'd been brave. I wish I'd chosen love over comfort, even knowing it might have failed, even knowing it might have been harder, even knowing it might have meant less money and a smaller house and a life that didn't look as good from the outside. Because here's the thing I learned too late, the thing that nobody tells you when you're young and ambitious and afraid. From the inside, comfort and misery can feel exactly the same. They're both quiet. They're both still. They both look like a man sitting in a chair, staring out a window, counting the hours. The only difference is that one of them chose the quiet, and the other one had it imposed on him by his own cowardice. I want to tell the young men something, specifically the young men because I was one, and I know how your minds work, because mine worked the same way. You think providing is loving. You think being reliable is the same as being present. You think that if you work hard enough and earn enough and build a big enough house, the people inside it will be happy, and your job is done. But providing is not loving. Providing is providing. It's important, yes. Bills need to be paid. Roofs need to not leak. Children need to eat. But a child who is fed and housed and driven to school by a father who is physically present and emotionally absent, That child knows. They can feel the difference. They can feel the empty space where your heart should be, and they'll spend their whole lives trying to fill it, in themselves and in others, and they won't even know why. I know this because I was that father. I was there for every wrestling match and every dance recital and every parent-teacher conference, and I was never really there. My body showed up. My heart was in a shoebox in a closet. And I want to tell the young women something, too. Something that Diane should have been told. That I should have told her. You deserve someone who chooses you with their whole heart, not most of it. Not the part that's left over after they've given the best of it to a ghost or a memory or a version of themselves they can't let go of. The whole thing. And if the person you're with can't give you that, no matter how kind they are, no matter how responsible, no matter how good they look on paper, that's not enough. It's not your job to be someone's consolation prize. It's not your job to fill the space that someone else left. You deserve to be the first choice, the only choice, the one whose name makes their face light up, instead of just nod. Diane deserved that. She never got it from me, and I carry that guilt, alongside the grief, twin weights, that I'll carry until I die. Let me tell you how I spend my days now. I wake up around 6. I sit by the window. I drink my coffee. I eat my cereal. I go for a walk, if my knees cooperate, around the neighborhood, past the houses where families live, and children play, and dogs bark, and life. Actual life. The noisy, messy, exhausting kind is happening on the other side of walls that I can see but can't enter. I come home. I read. I watch some television. I eat my sandwich. I nap sometimes in the afternoon in the chair, and I dream about Bleecker Street. I always dream about Bleecker Street. The same dream always. I'm standing in the doorway, and she's in the kitchen, and the garlic is too strong, and the radiator is too hot, and the window is cracked. And she's barefoot and humming, and she turns around and sees me and smiles. That half smile, the one from the photograph, and she says, "You came back." And I say, "I never left." And then I wake up, and I'm in the chair, and the house is quiet, and she's gone. I had a physical last month. The doctor, a young woman not much older than Rachel, told me I was in decent health for my age. Blood pressure a little high. Cholesterol a little high. Knees are shot, but whose aren't? She said I could live another 20, 25 years if I took care of myself. 25 more years. I smiled and thanked her and drove home and sat in the chair and thought, 25 more years of what? 25 more years of cereal and sandwiches and frozen dinners and walks through a neighborhood where no one knows my name? 25 more years of dreaming about a kitchen I left in 1988. I don't say this for pity. I've had enough pity, most of it my own. I say it because I want you to understand the arithmetic. I'm 63. I will likely die somewhere between 75 and 88. That means I have roughly 12 to 25 years left. I spent 3 of my years, 3 out of 63, with the person who made me feel most alive. 3 years out of a whole lifetime. And those 3 years are the only ones I think about. They're the only ones that glow. Everything else, the career, the house, the marriage, the kids, all of it. Everything else is gray. Not bad, not terrible, just gray. The color of a life lived at half capacity. A life where the brightness was turned down so low you forgot what full light looked like. 3 years of color and a lifetime of gray. That's my legacy. That's what I built. Don't build what I built. Don't choose the sure thing because you're afraid of the real thing. Don't pick the person who's easy because the person who's right is hard. Don't let fear dress itself up as wisdom and convince you that playing it safe is the same as living well. It isn't. Playing it safe is just dying slowly in a comfortable chair. Love the person who sees you. Love them even when it's terrifying, especially when it's terrifying because the terror means it matters. Stay in the kitchen. Stay on the fire escape. Stay even when you're scared, even when the apartment is too small and the future is uncertain, and the world is telling you there's something better, something safer, something smarter waiting for you out there. There isn't. There isn't anything out there that compares to being truly known by another human being. I've looked. I've spent 40 years looking. The corner office doesn't compare. The house doesn't compare. The 401k doesn't compare to. None of it compares to a woman's bare feet on a cold tile floor and the sound of a typewriter in the morning and the feeling That deep, unshakable, bone-level feeling that you are exactly where you're supposed to be. I had it. I let it go. And now I sit by a window that faces east, and the sun comes up, and the coffee goes cold, and the toast stays on the plate, and I wait. I don't know what I'm waiting for. Maybe forgiveness, maybe peace, maybe just the end, which comes for all of us, eventually, and which I no longer fear the way I once did. Death is just the last room in a long hallway, and I've already walked through all the others, and most of them were empty. If you're standing in a doorway right now, listen to me. Listen to an old man who knows what he's talking about, who paid for this knowledge with everything he had. Stay. Whatever you're thinking about leaving, the person, the place, the messy, uncertain, terrifying thing that makes your heart beat too fast, stay. Not because it'll be easy. It won't. Not because it'll work out. It might not. Stay because the alternative, the comfortable, safe, gray, quiet, careful alternative, will eat you alive from the inside, and you won't even notice until you're 63 years old, and the only thing keeping you company is a photograph and a cracked window and the ghost of a woman who loved you better than you deserved. Stay. That's all I've got. That's the whole lesson. 36 years of regret and heartache and sitting in a quiet house, distilled into one word. Stay. The coffee's gone cold again. The sun's all the way up now, above the rooftops, bright and indifferent. Another day, another Tuesday or Wednesday or whatever it is. The days don't have names anymore when you live alone. They just have light and dark and the space between. I'm going to put the photograph face up today. I'm going to look at her, the fire escape, the denim jacket, the half smile. I'm going to look at her and I'm going to say out loud, in this empty kitchen, what I should have said in that doorway 35 years ago. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I was afraid. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I knew it, and I left anyway. And there's no excuse for that, and there never will be. But you should know, wherever you are, whatever comes after this, if anything comes after this, you should know that you were right. My place was a person, my place was you, and I'm sorry I didn't sit down. The house is quiet. The street is quiet. The whole world is quiet this morning, like it's listening, or maybe that's just what silence sounds like when you've finally told the truth. He puts the photograph down. He looks out the window. The sun is up. The coffee is cold. The day stretches ahead, long and empty, and his. And somewhere, in a harbor in Maine, the tide comes in and goes out, carrying with it the smallest particles of a woman who loved a man who was too afraid to stay. The tide doesn't judge. It just moves. The way time moves, the way life moves, with you or without you.